You are in the ER, you're a pink person, and on the bed there's a patient, okay, and he's red too. So he's not feeling well, he's not breathing properly, he's not properly conscious, and you do the thing we always do in the ER at any hospital. What we always do is we take arterial blood gas. It's an ABG because that's the thing to do. And that's basically a blood test you take from the arteries instead of the veins, and you inject it into a machine and it gives you a receipt with some numbers. And this video is probably gonna, or mainly gonna, be about those values. So you get out a sheet of paper like this, and it has some values on it. Okay, so we're gonna be talking about those, an ABG. The first thing you do is the clever thing to do. The first thing you do is the clever thing to do, and that's look at the pH value. Because you want to know, is this patient feeling bad because he has too much acid in the body and he is acidic, or because he has too much base in the body and is basic? Because you know, we have to have a certain pH in the body for our cells to function properly, for our enzymes to function properly. If you're too acidic or too basic, you're not going to function properly, you're going to be very sick. So that's the first thing we look at. And in this case, you see that the pH of this patient is low. His pH is low, that means he's acidic. He has too much acid in his body. We have to figure out the cause, the reason. But so far, you know that you can put a diagnosis, sort of. You know this patient has an acidosis. And because you've watched this video, you know that there are two main causes for why you would have an acidosis. It could be, number one, it could be due to your lungs, right? Your respiratory system. Your respiratory system. You can have a respiratory cause for acidosis, or respiratory acidosis. What happens is basically you're breathing too slow. You're very ineffective in breathing for whatever reason. You're not getting the carbon dioxide out. What happens is you end up with a lot of carbon dioxide in your body, and you may or may not know carbon dioxide is actually very acidic when you have a lot of it in your body. So if you have a lot of carbon dioxide, you will be acidic, and we will say you have a respiratory acidosis. So being a clever person, having watched this video, the next thing you look at is the carbon dioxide value. If it's high, you know that's the reason for the acidic pH, and you can say it's the respiratory acidosis. Let's fix that. But turns out this patient has a low carbon dioxide value, so that cannot be the cause. It could not be a respiratory cause. It has to be the other cause, and the other cause is, actually there are many causes, but we call it a metabolic cause. A metabolic cause. So you already know that this patient has a metabolic acidosis because we ruled out the respiratory part. When you have a metabolic acidosis, you can actually look at another value, and that value is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is going to be low because you have so much acid in your body that bicarbonate is being spent, all of it is being spent on trying to get that acid away. So that's the reason you have low bicarbonate in the body. You now know you have a metabolic acidosis, okay? Now we have to figure out what is the cause for the metabolic acidosis. Well, there are, as always, or not as always, there are two causes here as well. Two main causes you have a metabolic acidosis. So it could be, number one, that you are making a lot of acid in your body. For whatever reason, you're making a lot of new acid, or you're taking in a lot of, you're introducing a lot of acid into your body. Another cause could be that you're not getting rid of it. Not getting rid of the acid properly. Rid of acid properly. Okay, so is there a test to differentiate those two? Yes, there is. If the reason for your acidosis, your metabolic acidosis, is that you're making too much acid, your anion gap, something called anion gap, will be high. Actually, that looks like silver. We should call it anion gap, will be very high. Okay, and that is actually not a value you get from the blood test. You have to calculate it yourself. And I'm going to explain how you do that. But first, let me just note here that if you have a high anion gap, the reason for metabolic acidosis is that you're making too much acid. In this case, you would have a normal anion gap. So what is anion gap? I'm going to try to explain that as well as I can. The thing is, in your body, you have some positive ions. I don't like that color. You have some positive colors, and you have some colors. I mean, you have some positive ions, and you have some negative ions. Okay, and you have an equal amount of both of them. You have an equal amount of positive ions. That's way too big. An equal amount of positive ions as negative ions. So you're neutral. The positive ions are mainly, or a lot of them, is the sodium. As you can see, there's a plus sign there. While the anions, there are several we can mention here. One being bicarbonate. It has a minus sign. In addition, chloride, that has a minus sign. Or it could be other acids, okay? And this we can call the anion gap, because if you have a lot of other anions, negative ions in your blood, this part will be more and your chloride and bicarbonate will be less in the body, okay? Because the body always tries to balance it out. The positive ones are equal to the negative ones. So sodium, the amount of sodium in the body is going to be equal to the amount of bicarbonate and chloride and other. So instead of other, we can just write anion gap. I think it fell out of the screen now. Anyway, so what you will see is to calculate the anion gap, you basically just take sodium minus bicarbonate minus the chloride. Then you get the anion gap, okay? So this minus these two, you'll get this one. So if the reason for your acidosis, you have too much acid in your body, is that you're making more other types of acids, your anion gap will go up, okay? If the reason is that you're not getting rid of of acid well enough, and the one way you get rid of bicarbonate is by using bicarbonate. If your bicarbonate goes down, your chloride will go up, so others won't change. Okay, so your anion gap won't change. So what could be the reason you're making more acid? Well, there are several causes, but the most important ones are going to be if you're not supplying enough oxygen. Yes, let's use another color. If you're not supplying enough oxygen to the tissue, for whatever reason, the tissue has to make energy without using any oxygen, and that produces lactic acid, right? This is an acid, and you will get a lot of that. So when you're doing your test trying to figure out what the cause is, you have to check for lactic acid. So why would you not get enough oxygen? Well, it might not be enough oxygen in the air, you're choking, your lungs aren't working properly, you don't have enough hemoglobin, your heart isn't pumping the blood so the oxygen doesn't get to the tissue, maybe your heart is failing for whatever reason, cardiac infarction for example, or it could be that you're bleeding. That's why your blood pressure isn't high enough. Blood doesn't get to where it should be, and oxygen doesn't get there. You're producing lactic acid and having a metabolic acidosis. Other cause could be that you're diabetic. If you're diabetic, and you get too little insulin, especially in diabetes type 1, mellitus type 1. And what happens is, if you get too little insulin, your body will think that you don't have any glucose, okay? And when you don't have any glucose, the body will start breaking down a lot of fat. And when you break down a lot of fat, and this is just like diabetic people do, not in normal patients, or normal people, I mean, people without diabetes, they will not do the same thing. But if patients with diabetes break down a lot of fat because they have little insulin, some of this fat will turn into something called ketones. Ketones are energy packs. The problem with them is that they're very negative, they're very acidic. So that will also give you an acidosis. There could be other causes as well. For example, you've gotten in methanol or something that metabolizes into acids. But I'm not going to write that here. So those are two important causes. So when you're doing your tests, you want to trying to figure out the cause, and you've been a good boy or girl, and you've figured out that there's acidosis in the patient because he has low pH. You know it's not respiratory, you know it's metabolic because the carbon dioxide is low, and you figured out that the reason he's has acidosis is because he's making too much acid, because his anion gap is high. You check for lactic acid and his glucose and ketones. Okay, so just check that. Lactic acid, that could be the cause. It could be ketones in the urine, or you can check his glucose in the blood if he has very low glucose. But the problem could also be that he's not getting rid of enough oxygen, getting rid of enough acid, and the reasons for those could be, one way to get rid of acid in the body is kidney. The other is bicarbonate. So if the kidneys aren't working properly, whatever reason that is, that could be a reason you're not getting rid of the acid. That could be the reason for acidosis. So check the kidney function with creatinine, for example. And another way you're getting rid of acid is bicarbonate. This is a buffer. And you can lose off it a lot of bicarbonate if you have a diarrhea. Okay, you will lose a lot of it. So then you try to treat the cause, right? Give oxygen if he lacks oxygen. Give insulin if he lacks insulin. Try to fix the cause for kidney failure. Give him dialysis if that's necessary. And give the patient some bicarbonate if he has diarrhea. Give him some fluid. So the problem with some problems with acidosis could be that the heart stops functioning properly. Okay, so your heart can start failing, and that gives you a shock, right? It doesn't pump out, and your blood pressure falls down. That's a shock. Another problem could be when the heart is not functioning well. You can get edema in the lungs, fluid in the lungs, lung edema. Another problem could be if you have a lot of acid in the blood, the cells are trying to buffer that away. Okay, so what the cells do is they take in the acid and they spit out potassium. So you can actually get hyperkalemia, which could give you cardiac arrhythmia, kalemia. So check when you're doing these tests. Also check for the potassium. Maybe it's too low. That could be a reason. So now I've gone through acidosis very quickly, and the main points here are how to diagnose acid-base disorder. That's looking at the pH. How do you differentiate between a respiratory cause and metabolic cause? And within the metabolic cause, how do you differentiate between those causes where you have too much acid being produced in the body, like lactic acid and ketone, and when you're just not getting rid of the acid, which is kidney and bicarbonate. And all of this can be done just by looking at some very simple blood tests. Hope it was helpful.